I was almost asleep when the doorbell rang. Not a polite little ding-dong either. 3 hard presses, one after another, like whoever stood on my porch had already decided their emergency was my responsibility. I looked at the clock on the side table. 9:47 p.m. The lamp beside my chair was still on, throwing a soft yellow circle over the living room. I had been sitting in Margaret's old recliner, the blue one, with the worn armrest where her hand used to rest, when we watched Wheel of Fortune. She'd been gone almost 4 years by then, but some evenings I still sat there because the house felt less empty that way. The bell rang again. All right, I muttered, pushing myself up slower than I liked. My knees popped. My back gave me that sharp little warning it had been giving me since I turned 60. I'm coming. When I opened the door, my son stood under the porch light with 2 suitcases at his feet. Beside him was his wife wearing a cream-colored coat, holding a leather tote bag, looking calm as a bank manager. Dad, my son said, we're moving in. I blinked at him. Behind them, their SUV sat in my driveway with the hatch still open. More bags were stacked inside. For how long, I asked. My son rubbed the back of his neck. Just for a little while. Lee's situation got messy. His wife stepped forward before he could say more. It'll be easier if we just get settled tonight. We're exhausted. She said it like I had invited them. I looked at my son. Really looked at him. I waited for him to explain, apologize, say anything that sounded like he remembered this was still my house. He looked down and picked up one of the suitcases. That hurt more than the words. Still, he was my boy. 35 years old, sure, but in my mind he was still the kid who used to fall asleep in the back seat after Little League games, cleats muddy hair stuck to his forehead. So I stepped aside. Come on in, I said. His wife smiled like I had passed a test. They rolled those suitcases over my front threshold across the rug Margaret picked out at a flea market in Noblesville and straight into the hallway. I barely had the door closed when my daughter-in-law reached into her tote bag and pulled out a sheet of paper. Not regular printer paper, laminated. She handed it to me with both hands. I made a basic house schedule, she said, just so everyone knows expectations. At the top in neat black letters it said, House rules. I read the first few lines. Breakfast ready by 6 a.m. Bathrooms cleaned every night. Shirts pressed. Dresses hung, not folded. For a second, I honestly thought it was a joke. I looked at my son again. He avoided my eyes and pretended to adjust the suitcase handle. My daughter-in-law tapped the page with one manicured finger. Nothing unreasonable. Structure helps everyone. I felt something rise in my chest. Not anger exactly, not yet. More like disbelief with a hard edge on it. This is for my house, I asked. She smiled. For all of us. I looked past her into the kitchen where Margaret's recipe cards still sat in a little wooden box by the stove. I looked at the refrigerator covered in old family pictures. My son missing his front teeth. Margaret holding him at Brown County State Park. Me with black hair and a tool belt. Then I looked back at that laminated sheet, and I smiled. Well, I said that's organized. My son let out a breath like he'd been holding it. That first night I gave them the guest room. Fresh sheets, clean towels. I even carried one suitcase down the hall before my right hip reminded me I was not 40 anymore. Thanks, Dad, my son said quietly when his wife went to get something from the car. I stopped in the hallway. You okay? He swallowed. Yeah, just a rough month. I wanted to ask him what kind of rough month ended with his wife handing me a chore list in my own living room. But he looked tired and ashamed, and I was tired too. So I said get some sleep. The next morning I found my coffee mugs moved to a different cabinet. By lunchtime, the thermostat had been changed from 70 to 74. By dinner, my Wi-Fi password was too hard to remember, so my daughter-in-law reset it. On the second day, I came back from Kroger and found Margaret's recliner halfway across the living room. My son had one hand on the back of it. His wife stood nearby, pointing toward the garage. What's going on, I asked. She turned with that bright smile. We're just opening the space. This chair is a little dated. I set the grocery bag on the counter. That was your mother's chair, I said to my son. He froze. For half a second, I saw the boy in him again. The one who cried into my shirt at Margaret's funeral. Then his wife said, we're not throwing it away, just storing it. My son looked at me, then looked away. They moved it into the garage under an old tarp. That night, the laminated house rules sheet appeared on my refrigerator, stuck right over a picture of Margaret holding our son on his first Christmas. I stood there a long time. Then I moved the picture to the side so I could still see her face. At exactly 6 o'clock the next morning, I got up. Not quietly. I started the old vacuum cleaner Margaret bought sometime around 1988. That thing sounded like a lawnmower full of gravel. I ran it right outside the guest room door. Then I turned on the washing machine. then the coffee grinder, then my little kitchen radio tuned to classic country out of Indianapolis. Willie Nelson filled the hallway while the vacuum roared under my hand. The guest room door flew open. My daughter-in-law stood there with her hair messy and her eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" I turned off the vacuum. "Oh," I said, "morning. It is 6 o'clock." "I know." My son appeared behind her, rubbing his face. "Dad, come on." I leaned on the vacuum handle. I figured if we're all making rules now, I'd start with mine. Neither of them spoke. The coffee maker hissed behind me. For the first time since they arrived, my daughter-in-law didn't have a ready answer. I smiled, not because it was funny, because if I didn't smile, I might have said something I couldn't take back. That evening, after they went to their room, I stood in the kitchen rinsing my coffee cup. The house had gone quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Then I heard her voice from down the hall, low but clear enough. "This place needs to stop feeling like your dad's house." I held the cup under the faucet until the water ran over my fingers. My son said something I couldn't catch. Then she answered, "No, I'm serious. If we're going to stay, things have to change." I turned off the faucet. For the first time, I understood something. They hadn't come to stay with me. They had come to take over. By the second week, I had started learning a strange thing about losing control of your own home. It doesn't happen all at once. Nobody walks in with a flag and plants it in your carpet. They move one mug, one chair, one photograph, one habit, and if you don't object fast enough, they take your silence as permission. My son Daniel started parking in my spot in the garage. He didn't ask. He just came home one evening from his sales job over in Fishers and pulled his silver SUV into the left side where I'd parked my pickup for 27 years. When I opened the door from the kitchen, he was already stepping out, briefcase in hand. "Oh," he said, seeing me standing there. "I figured it'd be easier. Kelly has the driveway, and you don't go out much at night." I looked past him at my truck sitting outside under a cold March drizzle. "Is that right?" I said. He shifted his briefcase from one hand to the other. "I mean, just while we're here." Just while we're here. That became the magic phrase. Kelly used it for everything. She moved my cereal to a lower cabinet because, as she put it, "This pantry needs flow." She replaced my old bath mat because it looked tired. She put my recliner, Margaret's recliner, really farther back into the garage and stacked 2 plastic bins in front of it, like if she buried it deep enough, it would stop mattering. One Saturday morning, I came in from trimming the hedges and found a white sectional sofa where the recliner used to sit. It still had the delivery tags hanging off one side. Kelly stood in the living room with her phone out taking pictures. "Doesn't this open everything up?" she asked. I wiped my hands on an old rag. "Where'd it come from?" "Wayfair, good sale." Daniel stood by the window pretending to study the receipt. I looked at him. "You two buying furniture for a place you're only staying in for a little while?" Kelly laughed lightly. "It's still useful, Dennis. We can take it with us later." She always called me Dennis. Never Dad, never Mr. Bennett. Just Dennis, like I was a co-worker she was trying to manage without offending. I walked into the garage later that afternoon. Margaret's chair was there under the tarp, one wooden leg showing. I pulled the tarp back and stood looking at it. The fabric was faded on the arms. There was a little coffee stain on the left cushion from when Margaret laughed too hard at something on TV and spilled half her mug. I never cleaned it all the way out. Didn't want to. I lowered myself onto an old paint bucket beside it and sat there until the light changed. That was where my neighbor found me. Harold Wilkes had lived next door for 22 years. Retired Hamilton County Sheriff's deputy, tall, narrow man with a gray mustache and a way of noticing things you didn't want noticed. He knocked twice on the open garage frame. "You hiding from company or hiding evidence?" I looked up. "Both, maybe." He stepped inside and nodded toward the chair. That didn't move itself. No, Margaret would have put somebody in the ground for moving that chair. Despite myself, I laughed once. She would have started with a lecture, then gone from there. Harold leaned against my workbench. "They settling in okay?" I could hear the question under the question. "They're settling in," I said. He looked toward the house. Through the kitchen window, Kelly was moving around like she'd been born there. Daniel stood beside her, nodding at something on her phone. Harold followed my eyes. "People don't take a house all at once," he said. "They make you feel like a guest first." I didn't answer. Because he was right. A few days later, Kelly invited another couple over for dinner. She told me at 4 in the afternoon while I was checking the mail. "Just so you know," she said, "some friends from my office are coming by around 7. Nothing fancy." I looked down at the electric bill in my hand. That would have been good to know earlier. "Oh, it's casual. Don't worry. Don't worry." I made myself scarce mostly because I didn't feel like sitting through small talk in my own living room while Kelly performed her version of family life. Around 8, I came in through the back door with a bag of trash from the garage. I had on my old Carhartt jacket and work gloves. A man I didn't know stood near the kitchen island holding a glass of wine. He glanced at me and said, "Hey, are you the handyman?" The room went still for half a breath. Kelly's smile twitched. Daniel looked at me. I waited. It would have taken him 3 seconds. That's my dad. That's his house. But he just stared at the floor. Kelly gave a small laugh and said, "Oh, that's Dennis. That's Dennis. Not my father-in-law, not Daniel's dad. Just Dennis." The man flushed. "Sorry, I didn't realize." "No harm," I said. But there was harm. It just didn't make noise. I went upstairs, sat on the edge of my bed, and looked at Margaret's picture on the dresser. She was standing in front of Lake Michigan, hair blown sideways, laughing at me because I never could take a straight photograph. "I don't know what happened to him," I said quietly. Of course, the picture didn't answer. The real answer came 3 nights later. I had gotten up around 11:30 because old men and full glasses of iced tea after dinner are a bad combination. On my way back from the bathroom, I saw light under Daniel and Kelly's door. Their voices were low. I wasn't trying to listen. At least that's what I told myself. Then I heard Kelly say, "We can't keep pretending this is temporary." Daniel said, "I know. We need him to sign before he changes his mind." My hand tightened on the hallway rail. Daniel's voice dropped. "I don't want to put Dad somewhere." A pause. Then Kelly said, "Not a nursing home. Don't make it sound ugly. Just somewhere smaller. He doesn't need all this space." All this space. The house Margaret and I had paid off 1 overtime shift at a time. The house where Daniel took his first steps. The house where I held my wife's hand during the last winter of her life. I stood there in the dark hallway, barefoot on the carpet, feeling older than I had felt in years. Daniel said he's not going to like it. Kelly answered he'll adjust. He always does. I went back to my bedroom and did not sleep. At 6:15 the next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with my first cup of coffee, staring at the laminated rules still stuck to the refrigerator. Margaret's Christmas picture had been pushed to the side again. My hands shook a little when I picked up my phone. Not from fear, from making a decision I had been avoiding for too long. I scrolled to a number I hadn't called in almost a year. Bennett and Lowe Estate Planning, the receptionist said, "This is Dennis Bennett. I need to speak with Elaine Porter." A few minutes later, Elaine came on the line. Her voice was calm and familiar. "Dennis," she said, "is everything all right?" I looked toward the hallway where my son and his wife were still sleeping. "No," I said, "but I'm done pretending it is." There was a pause. "Is this about the trust we made after Margaret passed?" I closed my eyes. "Yes," I said, "I think it's time." I expected Elaine Porter to tell me I was overreacting. Instead, she said, "Come by my office this afternoon. Bring whatever you think matters, even if it feels small." That sentence stayed with me all morning. Even if it feels small. Funny how the little things are usually the first signs that something bigger is wrong. By the time I drove to her office on Main Street in Carmel, I had a grocery bag sitting on the passenger seat. Inside it were things I never imagined carrying into an attorney's office. The laminated house rules. Pictures I had taken with my phone. Copies of text messages Daniel had accidentally sent to our family group before deleting them. A receipt for the sectional sofa that had been delivered to my address. And one old photograph of Margaret sitting in her blue recliner, smiling with a cup of coffee in her hand. Elaine looked through everything without interrupting. Finally, she folded her hands. "You're fortunate," she said. 4 years ago, after Margaret passed, you agreed to create an irrevocable trust instead of waiting. I remember. At the time, you told me you didn't want your son burdened with probate." I nodded. "That hasn't changed." "No. What has changed," she continued, "is that you now need stronger protections while you're still alive." I leaned back in my chair. "I don't want revenge, Elaine." "I know. I just want my house to feel like mine again." She smiled sadly. "That's a very different thing." She explained the paperwork in plain English. The trust already owned the house. I still had the absolute right to live there for the rest of my life. Nobody could force a sale. Nobody could pressure me into signing ownership away. But we could strengthen language regarding coercion, unauthorized occupancy, and attempts to manipulate estate decisions. "Will this hurt Daniel forever?" I asked. Elaine didn't answer immediately. "No," she finally said, "but refusing to set boundaries might." Driving home, I stopped at a red light and realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired. Tired of walking around my own kitchen like I needed permission. Tired of pretending every insult was an accident. Most of all, tired of hoping Daniel would suddenly become the son I remembered. When I pulled into the driveway, another delivery truck was parked outside. 2 men were unloading boxes labeled Home Office Collection. I carried my grocery bag inside. Kelly met me in the hallway. "Oh, perfect," she said. "Could you sign for these?" "What are they?" "Desk furniture." "For where?" She smiled. The den. Our den, she laughed. You're funny, I signed. Not because I approved, because I wanted the receipt. That evening, Harold wandered over carrying 2 bottles of root beer. He refused to drink alcohol after retiring from the sheriff's department. Thought I'd rescue you, he said. We sat on the back patio while the sun settled behind the maple trees. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, he asked how bad. I handed him 1 bottle. They're measuring rooms. He nodded. They're buying furniture. He nodded again. They're talking about moving me somewhere smaller. That finally made him look at me. They actually said that. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he took a slow drink. You know, he said, I spent 32 years answering family disputes. I remember. The ones that ended the worst weren't about money. No, they were about respect. He pointed toward my house. They stopped respecting you before they ever started wanting your house. That sentence hit harder than anything else. Aimed. Over the next couple of weeks, something changed inside me. Not outside. Outside, I became easier than ever. Kelly asked if I could make breakfast. Sure. She wanted shirts picked up from the cleaners. No problem. Daniel asked if I could wait for the cable technician. Happy to. The more agreeable I became, the more careless they became. Kelly stopped lowering her voice during phone calls. Daniel stopped looking guilty. Boxes kept arriving. Paint samples appeared on the dining room table. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and found blueprints spread across the counter. Kelly looked up. Oh, don't worry. Just brainstorming. For what? She pointed. The wall between the den and living room. You're taking down a wall. If we stay long-term. She caught herself too late. Daniel looked at her. She forced a smile. I mean, if. I simply nodded. Inside, another piece clicked into place. Every few days I'd meet Elaine, sometimes only 15 minutes, sometimes an hour. She never encouraged me to humiliate my son. Quite the opposite. Stay calm, she'd say. Let the facts do the work. So that's what I did. Every text, every receipt, every picture. Nothing dramatic, just facts. One afternoon she asked, do you have photographs showing what the house looked like before they moved in? I smiled for the first time in days. About 20 years worth. The hardest evening came late in April. Rain tapped softly against the garage roof. I pulled back the tarp covering Margaret's recliner. Dust floated through the beam of my flashlight. I sat down. The springs groaned the same way they always had. For a few minutes, I let myself miss her. If you were here, I whispered, you would have known what to do. Of course she didn't answer. But I remembered something she used to tell Daniel whenever he'd let kids at school push him around. Being kind doesn't mean letting people walk through you. I sat there for a long time thinking about that. Maybe I hadn't been protecting my son. Maybe I'd only been protecting myself from the pain of confronting him. There was a difference. A big one. The following Saturday morning, Kelly came into the kitchen carrying a notebook. Good news, she announced. I looked up from the newspaper. What happened? I booked the 4th of July barbecue. Booked? She grinned. My family, your family, neighbors, everybody. I folded the paper. That sounds ambitious. It'll be perfect. She flipped through her notebook. Oh, and I already told everyone the lawyer might stop by. I looked at her carefully. The lawyer? Yes. She smiled confidently. We'll finally get the paperwork handled while everyone's together. Daniel froze halfway through pouring his coffee. Kelly. She ignored him. It just makes sense. She looked back at me. I mean, once the house is officially in our names, we can really start renovating. Silence. She mistook it for agreement. So I'll tell everyone to expect good news. I slowly folded my newspaper. Then I smiled. I think that's an excellent idea. She beamed. Daniel looked from her to me. Something in my face must have unsettled him, because for the first time in weeks, he looked afraid. The 4th of July arrived hot enough to make the air shimmer over the driveway. By 9 that morning, Kelly had already taken over my kitchen. She had a clipboard in one hand and her phone in the other. Hot dogs on the left side of the grill, she called toward Daniel. Burgers on the right. We'll put the desserts on the island. She turned and saw me carrying a folding table out of the garage. Oh, Dennis, she said cheerfully, could you wipe these down before everyone gets here? I looked at the table, then at her. Sure. She smiled satisfied and walked away before I could even set it down. Harold, who had been pretending to trim the hedge along our property line for the last 10 minutes, caught my eye. You all right? He asked quietly. I will be. He nodded once. That's all I needed to hear. Around noon, the first cars started arriving. My younger sister Nancy brought potato salad. My cousin Rick showed up carrying 2 coolers full of soda. Kids ran through the backyard with little American flags in their hands, while somebody played old country music through a portable speaker. For a while, it almost felt like the family gatherings Margaret used to host. Almost. Then Kelly started giving people tours of my house. Our kitchen gets amazing morning light, she told one couple. She pointed toward the den. We're thinking of opening this wall up after the paperwork is finished. After the paperwork. Nobody corrected her because nobody knew the truth. Not yet. I watched Daniel standing beside the grill flipping burgers without saying much. He kept glancing toward me. Every time our eyes met, he looked away. Harold wandered over, carrying 2 paper plates. Mind if I steal a burger before the crowd does? Go ahead. He leaned against the fence beside me. You nervous? A little. You should be. I looked at him. That's supposed to help. He smiled. No. Then his expression turned serious. But you're doing the right thing. At 1:30, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. Elaine Porter stepped out carrying a slim leather portfolio. Kelly noticed her before anyone else. She clapped her hands together. Oh, perfect. She hurried across the yard. Elaine, we're so glad you could make it. Elaine smiled politely. Good afternoon. Kelly looked around at everyone gathered near the patio. This is wonderful timing. We can finally get the paperwork signed before dessert. Several relatives turned toward us. Nancy looked confused. Paperwork. Kelly laughed. Oh, nothing exciting. Dennis has decided it's time to transfer the house. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. He whispered Kelly, but she kept talking. It'll save everyone trouble later. She reached into a kitchen drawer and came back holding a new box of pens. I even bought these. Elaine looked at me. I nodded once. She understood. Kelly held out one of the pens. Whenever you're ready. I smiled. We won't be needing your pen. She blinked. What? I said, we won't be needing your pen. The backyard became strangely quiet. Even the children seemed farther away. Elaine opened her portfolio. Since there appears to have been some misunderstanding, she said calmly, Mr. Bennett asked me to clarify the ownership status of this property. Kelly's smile faded. Elaine continued. The home was transferred into an irrevocable trust shortly after Mrs. Bennett passed away 4 years ago. Kelly frowned. What does that have to do with today? It means, Elaine replied evenly, Mr. Bennett no longer personally owns this house. Several relatives exchanged puzzled looks. Elaine continued before anyone could interrupt. The trust owns the property. Mr. Bennett retains lifetime occupancy. He cannot be forced to leave. The property cannot be transferred simply because someone asks. Kelly looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the ground. Elaine calmly removed several photographs from the folder. Over the past several weeks, she continued, Mr. Bennett has requested additional protections be added regarding attempts to pressure, manipulate, or coerce changes to his estate planning. Kelly folded her arms. This is ridiculous. Perhaps Elaine said the evidence will help explain why those protections became necessary. She laid the first photograph on the patio table. Margaret's blue recliner, covered by a tarp, hidden behind storage bins in the garage. Harold quietly looked away. My sister Nancy covered her mouth. Elaine placed down another photograph. The refrigerator. My family pictures pushed aside. The laminated house rules sheet hanging in the center. Breakfast ready by 6 a.m. Bathrooms cleaned every night. Shirts pressed. Dresses hung not folded. Nobody laughed. Elaine laid down copies of printed text messages. One highlighted sentence read, This place needs to stop feeling like your dad's house. Another, we need him to sign before he changes his mind. Then another, just somewhere smaller. Silence spread across the yard. Not awkward silence. The kind that settles when everyone suddenly understands the same thing. Kelly recovered first. This is completely out of context. Elaine didn't argue. She simply produced another page. Furniture invoices. Delivered to my address. Measurements for remodeling. Notes labeled, future office. Primary bedroom expansion, open living space. My cousin Rick slowly looked from the papers to Kelly. You already planned renovations. Kelly opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Harold finally spoke. His voice stayed calm. That chair belonged to Margaret. He wasn't talking about furniture anymore. Everybody knew it. Nancy quietly wiped a tear from her cheek. Daniel finally lifted his head. He looked at the picture of his mother's chair, then toward the garage, then at me. His face crumpled. His voice cracked. I knew. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted him. I knew Kelly wanted the house. He swallowed hard. I kept telling myself it would never go that far. He looked straight at me for the first time in weeks. I was wrong. Kelly grabbed his arm. Daniel. He gently pulled away. No. His voice became steadier. No, Dad deserves to hear this. He turned fully toward me. I should have stopped it. I should have spoken up the first night. When she handed you those rules. When she moved Mom's chair. When they thought you were the handyman. His eyes filled. And I didn't. Kelly stared at him as though she'd never seen him before. You're really doing this. Daniel answered without looking at her. Yes, for the first time all afternoon, I saw my son. Not the frightened husband. Not the man hiding behind silence. My son. Elaine quietly closed the folder. My work here is finished, she said, but mine wasn't. I took one slow step forward, looked at my son, then at the dozens of people standing in my backyard. Finally, I spoke. Nobody said a word. The only sound was the soft hiss from the grill where a couple of burgers had started to burn. I looked at Daniel, then at Kelly. I had imagined this moment more times than I cared to admit. In every version, I thought I would feel victorious. I didn't. Mostly I felt tired. I appreciate everyone's coming today, I said quietly. But I think we all know this barbecue stopped being about hamburgers a while ago. A few people gave nervous little laughs. They faded almost immediately. I turned to Daniel. When your mother was dying, she worried about one thing more than anything else. He lowered his head. She wasn't worried about the house. She wasn't worried about money. She was worried that you'd forget what kind of man she raised. His shoulders began to shake. I'm sorry, Dad. I know you are. I walked over to the patio table where Elaine's folder still lay open. I picked up the laminated house rules sheet. The edges were still stiff and smooth. I held it up. Do you know what bothered me the most about this? Kelly folded her arms but stayed silent. It wasn't the breakfast. It wasn't the bathrooms. It wasn't even the shirts. I looked directly at Daniel. It was that my own son stood there while someone handed his father instructions on how to live inside the home his mother and I spent 34 years paying for. Daniel covered his face with one hand. I know. No, I said gently. I don't think you do. I laid the laminated sheet back on the table. When people ask how families fall apart, they usually imagine one terrible day. I slowly shook my head. It almost never happens that way. It happens one quiet compromise at a time. One apology you never make. One disrespect you never challenge. One silence after another. Harold looked down at his boots. Nancy quietly nodded. Even Kelly seemed unable to meet anyone's eyes now. After a long silence, she finally spoke. I never wanted to hurt you. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I honestly thought... She stopped. What? I asked. I thought families were supposed to help each other. They are. I thought, she continued, if we were going to inherit the house someday anyway, then making it work for us now made sense. I nodded slowly. There it is. Nobody interrupted. You weren't waiting for an inheritance. You were living inside one. She opened her mouth again, then closed it. There was nothing left to defend. Daniel stepped closer. I've got credit card debt. The words came out in a rush. I never told you because I was embarrassed. He looked around at the family. I kept believing one more promotion would fix everything. It didn't. Then Kelly lost 2 clients. We started borrowing. Then borrowing more. I convinced myself moving here would only be temporary. His voice broke. But every time I should have told her no, I said nothing. He looked at me. I failed you. I took a deep breath. I know life can corner people. I've been broke. I've worked double shifts. I've skipped vacations. I've eaten peanut butter sandwiches for a week because your mother and I needed to pay the mortgage. A few relatives smiled sadly. We did what we had to do, but we never solved our problems by taking away someone else's peace. Daniel nodded through tears. No, you didn't. I reached into the garage. Earlier that morning, I had placed something beside the door, a faded red metal toolbox, the same one I carried for nearly 30 years as a union electrician. The handle was worn smooth. The corners were scratched. Inside were my old lineman's pliers, wire strippers, screwdrivers, and the tape measure Margaret bought me for our 20th anniversary because she said I was always borrowing everyone else's. I carried it over and handed it to Daniel. He stared at it. Dad, take it. He accepted it carefully. I don't understand. I know. I rested my hand on the lid. This toolbox built everything that mattered in my life. My career. This house. The life your mother and I shared. I looked him straight in the eyes. I'm not giving you a house. I'm giving you a chance. When you build something with your own hands again, come have dinner with me. Daniel began crying openly. Not loud, not dramatic, just the kind of crying a grown man does when he finally stops pretending. Kelly looked at him, then at me. Finally, she whispered, I don't deserve your kindness. I answered honestly. No, you don't. Another long silence settled over the backyard. Then I continued. But kindness isn't the same thing as surrender. Elaine quietly smiled. Harold tipped his cap. I looked at both of them. Then back at Daniel and Kelly. You have 7 days. Daniel nodded immediately. We'll go. I'll help with the security deposit on a small apartment. Kelly looked surprised. Why would you do that? Because I want you to leave. Not fail. She closed her eyes. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely ashamed. The moving truck came the following Saturday. Daniel carried more boxes than anyone else. Kelly barely spoke. Before leaving, Daniel walked into the garage. A few minutes later, he came back carrying Margaret's recliner. Without saying a word, he placed it exactly where it had always been, next to the front window, where the afternoon sunlight reached it around 4 o'clock. He stood there looking at it. I'm sorry. I know. He nodded once. Then he left. 3 months passed. One Sunday afternoon, there was another knock at my door. This time it was only Daniel. He held a small toolbox in one hand. Mine. Cleaned. Organized. He smiled nervously. I fixed the loose porch light. I noticed, and he hesitated. I was wondering if you wanted company for dinner. I looked at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. I've got enough meatloaf for 2. He laughed softly. Mom would have approved. She probably would have told us both we were being stubborn. He smiled. Definitely. We ate dinner at the old oak table. Not much conversation. We didn't need much. Some things heal quietly. About 6 months later, I received a handwritten letter from Kelly. There were no excuses. No blame. Just an apology. She admitted she had confused planning for control, efficiency for respect, helping for entitlement. I didn't rush to answer. Eventually, I wrote back. I accepted her apology. Trust takes much longer than forgiveness. That never changed. Neither did the trust. The legal documents stayed exactly as they were. Boundaries remained. So did love. These days, Margaret's recliner is back beside the living room window. The family photographs are back where they belong. And every now and then, Daniel comes over on a Saturday afternoon. Sometimes we fix little things around the house. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we just sit with coffee and watch the neighborhood go by. Growing older doesn't mean giving away your voice. It doesn't mean surrendering your dignity to keep the peace. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for your family is teach them where the boundary is and stand by it. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your self-respect, you're not alone. I'd be honored to hear what you learned from it. Thanks for spending this time with me, and take good care of yourself.